If dying wasn't already hard enough, right? We make it harder by
Yeah.
saying this is the way in which you should die. You should die, with rainbows all around you, love and light everywhere, and that you should only speak loving thoughts, while you're dying. Well, that's wonderful if you can do it, but it's not always so possible.
Frank Ostaseski is a Buddhist teacher, international lecturer, and a leading voice in contemplative end-of-life care. In 1987, he co-founded the Zen Hospice Project, the first Buddhist hospice in America. In this episode, Frank talks about how life and death are a package deal, how it's important not to shrink from any part of life, and he gives some tips on how to deal with fear. Frank also talks about how wanting to talk about death helps us in life. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, please do sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, this episode, Keeping Death as an Advisor.
Let me give you just the background, the story, because there's a story why you're here. We have this common friend, and she contacted you and asked you if you can participate, and you said, yeah, sure, I can participate to the Death Hangout. You've even been very generous because you said, I can send you my book. I can send you the 5 invitation, this book. And I said, oh, yeah, great. Can I have 2? Because I have a co-host. And you said, well, no, because you can have 1. And I said, yeah, that's fine. I've tried to have 2. 1 is enough. And I have to be very honest with you. I've read lots of books about death. And when I receive your book, and I say, oh, shit, I have so many books I have to read, so I will read this later on. But then I was curious, and I started to read it. And I have to say that, Frank, it's one of the best books that I read about death. Really, sincerely. It's just like, wow, I've cried reading your book. I was inspired. I was just like, shit, there's so many quotes and so many things I would like to discuss with you, but there's one chapter in this book which actually helped me a lot. This chapter is called Welcome Everything, Push Away Nothing. It inspired me so much. Can you just give us a little bit of background about this chapter, and what do you mean by that?
To welcome everything and push away nothing, it doesn't mean that we have to like what comes. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with it. It only means that we have to be willing to meet it. If it's on our doorstep, maybe it has something to teach us. So that's the first thing. And it kind of confronts us to welcome everything. How do we do that? I think that really what it's about is it kind of confronts our notion of judgment, that we know, first of all, everything that's right for us. I mean, do you know what will wake you up in your life? I don't. So I have to really pay attention to what's there in front of me. There's a story in the book about a beautiful man who was an eminent psychiatrist, and he developed Alzheimer's, and he couldn't no longer remember names or faces. And my friends went to his home for dinner, and they rang the bell, and he opened the door, and he looked confused for a period of time. And then he said, I'm sorry, I don't remember anymore. I can't recall your faces, but I know this is my house. And my home has always been a place where people were welcome. So I know that if you're standing on my doorstep, it is my job to invite you in. So please come in. And I mean, suppose we had that kind of relationship with the world. The great African-American writer, James Baldwin, he said there are so many things in life that we must face that we cannot change. But nothing can be changed unless it's faced. So for me, that's the heart of welcome everything, push away nothing.
I was facing lots of difficulties and tension in my life when I received this book, right? And I would keep repeating to myself, welcome everything, push away nothing, welcome everything, push away nothing. So it worked for me. But at the same time, you work in an hospice, which means death, which means this suffering. So how can you do that in these circumstances, these tough things that happens to you? Do you welcome even the pain, the sorrow, and all this?
I think it's most important there, actually. And again, to welcome doesn't mean that we have to like it or that we don't address it. I'm not encouraging martyrdom. People's pain needs to be well managed and their symptoms need to be adequately controlled. When we're in a fight with reality, we always lose. I was with a group of pediatric palliative care nurses, nurses who take care of children who are dying. And they were struggling. They were having a lot of burnout and exhaustion. And I asked them a simple question. I said, is it all right with you that children die? And they all said no. And I said, well, then you can't help them. I mean, imagine if you're a child and you're dying and everybody is fighting against this experience. No one is willing to be with you just as you are. Imagine how isolated you would become in such a situation. So to welcome everything and push away nothing, this is really an act of love. This is an act of inviting it all in and seeing what it has to show us. It can't be done as an act of will. It's not possible. We have to do it as an act of love. We mistake this by thinking that welcoming means agreement. And I'm not suggesting that. And that's where we get into problems, My wife is British, and they don't really use the term welcome in England so much. And so when she came to America, I had to teach it to her and show her what it meant. And she said, well, what does it mean? And I stretched my arms way, way out, and I said, this is what it means to welcome. It means no part of you is left out. Every part of you is included.
I love that, every part of you. And there's a story in this book about your experience in Guatemala with a colonel. And there was a part in you which was this rage, I believe. But maybe you can tell us the story. So how did you welcome everything in you?
Before I go into the story, I just want to emphasize that it's a practice. So I have to work at it all the time to welcome everything and push away nothing. But many years ago, I was in Guatemala where wars were raging and the government was taking all the land from the people of Guatemala, most particularly the Mayans. And I came into a small village where there was a tiny clinic being run by fundamentalist Christians. And there in that clinic, there was a young student doctor, wasn't really even a physician, who was manning this clinic. And into the clinic that night came a young boy, about 5 years old, with a severe stomach problem. We think it may have been a ruptured stomach, or we don't know. And it was clear that he needed surgery, or at least better medical care than we could offer in this clinic. And so I went to the colonel who was in charge of that particular village. And earlier that day, he had been showing me all the good things the army was doing for the people of Guatemala. And I thought he certainly won't turn down a gringo, a guy from the States with a press card. And so I knocked on his door, and he opened the door, and I said, there's this child in the clinic, and he's very, very sick, and I think he will die unless we get him to a hospital. Can we fly him in the helicopter? And the man looked at me like I was out of my mind. This colonel looked at me and he said, son indígenas. He said in Spanish, they are indigenous people, as if they were dirt, as if they were less than real, less than human. And he slammed the door. And I went back to that clinic and I worked with that child that night with his mother and father. They didn't speak Spanish, so we gestured back and forth. They spoke mostly Mayan. The mother had this beautiful corn mash brew that she made, a kind of home remedy, and she kept feeding it to the child. And the father thought I was a doctor. I've never felt so helpless in my life, Oliver. But I taught this father how to cradle his son's head so that he wouldn't be thrashing about. And this went on for a long time. And it was a horrible death, absolutely horrible. Tremendous pain, tremendous suffering. And that boy died that night. And the father put him over, wrapped him in a blanket, put him over his shoulder and carried him away. I never saw them again. And I was furious. I felt so much hatred in my heart for this colonel. And I'm very glad, actually, I didn't have access to some kind of weapon. I might have done something horrible. I left there, Guatemala, and came back to the States and worked for many years trying to improve the conditions there and stop the wars in Guatemala. That experience with the colonel is not something, the event is unforgivable. Unforgivable. There is ignorance in the world, and this colonel was demonstrating that. And it was impossible to forgive his actions. And yet, the man was forgivable. The individual was forgivable. So forgiveness isn't about condoning bad actions or unskillful behavior such as this. Forgiveness is really about learning how to set down old pain so it doesn't close our hearts and keep us from opening to the world, rather. I went home, worked doing political work. And one night I was home in my own house, and I was listening to the radio, and I was listening to the stories about the wars in Central America, and I was just furious. And I started screaming at the radio. And as I did, I saw my own son, who was 2 or 3 years old at the time, cowering in the corner with his hands over his eyes. And I thought, oh, I have to stop the war. Not the war in Guatemala, the war in my own heart. So I began that day. I put a picture of this colonel and the soldiers on my altar, and I began to work every day with forgiveness. And forgiveness is a fierce practice. It's not gentle. It's not nice. It's about meeting the ugliness in us with some mindfulness and mercy, I think. And it didn't feel real to me for a year. Every day I would practice forgiveness with this, and I couldn't really believe myself. But after about a year, I started to see this colonel as a human being who was acting out his ignorance. And I was able to finally forgive him, not condone the actions. That was never in my heart or my mind to do. It took me another year, Oliver, to forgive myself for what I wanted to do to that colonel. But I had to do that work, you see. I had to do that work. I had to set down that old pain so that my heart wouldn't be closed to the world, so that I wouldn't take out that anger and hatred on my own child, and I wouldn't walk through the world with that sort of view. So I had to do it, which meant that I had to welcome this horror into my own system. I had to welcome in my own hatred even to my own system, so that I could know it. Not so that I could accept that it was so that I could know it and not be ruled by it. And for me, that's what welcoming everything, push away nothing means. It means come to know the experience. We're always trying to push away experiences, and we never get to know them, and then they have us in a kind of stranglehold.
Just in terms of that knowing, could you just elaborate on that a little bit more? When you say about knowing the experience, in
Sure.
What way? What does that process look like? What's happening in that knowing?
That's a good question. That's a beautiful question. So, we have an experience, let's call it our fear or our grief, and we're always trying to get rid of it, right? We want to get over it. We want to overcome our fear, manage our fear, get rid of our grief. We're tired of it, But in pushing it away, we never come to know anything about it. We don't understand how it functions in our body. For example, when you're afraid, don't you know that you're afraid, right? Beautiful. So you know you're afraid, and there are cues that help you to understand that you're afraid. Your chest tightens, perhaps, or your tongue sticks to the roof of your mouth, or your toes get cold, or you start having planning thoughts in your mind. Those are all signals that fear is arising. Now, the first thing is, when we get to know those signals, we can begin to interact with that fear much earlier in the process, before we're swept away in terror. So that's the first thing that knowing helps us. But the second thing is that you say that you know you're afraid. That means that there's a part of you that is not afraid. The part that knows you're afraid is not afraid. And we can orient to that fear, or we can orient to the knowing.
Yeah, that's a bit mind-blowing, but makes perfect sense.
We're aware of fear. We don't have to get the fear to go away then. The fear can be there. It doesn't have to be overcome or chased away. It simply doesn't define everything that we are. It's not the only thing in the room, is another way to say it, right? Fear is not the only thing in the room. Something else is in the room. The adult is in the room. The adult awareness or the adult knowing is in the room.
Up until that point, as you said, it sweeps you away. Once it gets to that point, it's like it's too loud for that knowing to be involved.
That's right, because we're so absorbed in the fear, so identified with the fear, that there's nothing else available. We say, I am afraid. And we define ourselves exclusively by that experience.
Your book is about death, really. And you mentioned something in this book that people don't want to see death. Most of us, right? We don't want to recognize that. We just act if it's not there, right, really. And you mentioned something very true in this book. You said that if you believe that you'll be ready yourself at the last hour, you'll be like, okay, now I'm ready to die. We are deluding ourselves. We need to be able to think about death and not to get prepared. Prepare is maybe not the right word, but think about it, because it's truly part of our life. Maybe you can explain this, maybe a little bit better than I did.
Yeah. Here's the thing. In my view, life and death are a package deal. In other words, they come together. You don't get one without the other. A life that doesn't include death is only half a life. And I want to live a full life. Yeah. I want to really step into my life as much as possible. Yeah. Not shrink from any part of it. So in order to do that, I have to include the experience of dying. I mean, to imagine that at the time of our death, we will have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is a ridiculous gamble. We need to have this conversation now, and it's why I applaud you for bringing this to your viewers and listeners, that we have this conversation now so that we aren't swept away, again, by our fear of death. When we don't include death, we tend to take our life for granted. I mean, isn't it amazing to me that we all agree that everything changes? Seasons come and go, relationships come and go. My blonde hair has come and gone. Yeah? And yet, we imagine that we are the one solid thing that isn't coming and going. Everything's coming and going except me. That's how we kind of phrase the world. There's a beautiful passage in one of the old Eastern texts, the Bhagavad Gita, that says, what is the most wondrous thing in the world? What is most wondrous is that no man, no woman, though they see people dying all around them, believes that it will happen to them. We have this wonderful phrase, later, and it gives us a comfortable distance from our experience of dying. Yeah. It will happen later, maybe when I'm old, maybe when I'm sick, then it will happen later. So I don't have to think about it now. Yeah. Well, I want to think about it now. Just the other day, my wife and I were sitting on our back deck looking at the water. I said, maybe I have another 10 summers. And she said, oh, don't say that. And I said, no, I want to say that, because if I have 10 summers, I really want to think about how do I want to use them well? How can I most enjoy them? How can I share them with my children and my grandchildren? I think when we touch the precariousness of this life, we also come to touch its preciousness. And then we don't want to waste the moment. Then we want to step into our life fully. We want to use it in a respectful way. We want to tell the people we love that we love them. When we have death, we keep death close at hand at our fingertips. We don't hold on so tightly. We don't take ourselves so seriously, or we don't take our ideas so profoundly, We let go a little more easily. And I think this engenders a certain kind of kindness to ourselves and to the people that we know.
There's a quote of yours I read. It says, we cannot be truly alive without maintaining an awareness of death. I suppose that maintaining bit, what does that look like, that maintaining an awareness of death?
One way you could think about it is imagine how you meet endings. So how do you meet endings in your life, Keith? Like the end of a sentence, the end of a meal, or the end of a relationship. How do you end things? How do you leave a party? You go to a party, you're there for a few hours, and then you leave. How do you end the party? Do you just ghost out? Do you just slip away, hoping no one will notice that you were there? Or do you make it a habit of saying goodbye to people? How do you meet this experience of endings? That's a way that we could keep death close at hand, by just noticing the constant change of life. Death doesn't happen just at the end of a long road of illness and aging. It's here right now in the marrow of this moment.
I think it's that concept of there being little deaths all the way through. So even everything from, I think I might mention this before on another podcast, but there's a realization about my children growing up, and I look at photos of them when they were younger, and it's like those people have gone. They've grown up now. Those people don't exist anymore. That sort of little 5-year-old and 7-year-old, they were different people who are gone. So I think there's all those are like little endings as well in their own way.
Absolutely. And so knowing that that's so, knowing that your children will grow, it's inevitable that they will, and we hope that they grow happily, then you don't want to miss your time with them. You won't get to have them as 5-year-olds anymore. So you want to enjoy the time with them when they're 5, just as you want to enjoy the time with them when they're 7. And that's what I mean about keeping death as an advisor. It isn't that it makes everything morose or sad. Not at all. No, in fact, it causes us to really embrace our life. Oliver, earlier you said this book, and you held it up, is about death. I don't think so. I think this book is about life. I think it's about. No, it's okay. It's okay because it's often how. It's one of the reasons it's difficult to get journalists to pay attention because they're afraid of the subject of death. But I think actually what it's about is letting us see how the wisdom of death can show us how to love life.
You know, our website, we have a website at the Deaf Hangout, and the tagline of the Deaf Hangout is "Death, it's about life." So we really, we share exactly the same message. And sorry if I said it's about death. No, you're absolutely right. It's about life. You know, I remember the first time I realized that I would die. I was 3 years old, and I remember my mother. She said, "You have time. Don't worry about it. You have time. It's for later. You know, later, as you mentioned."
Yes.
And I've been to a website who talks about death, and they give exactly the same advice to parents how to talk to children about death, is to say, don't worry about that, it's for later, you know, you have time. We have been brought up or educated with this idea that it's a bad thing, death is a bad thing, and still it's part of us. You said it's part of our life. But you know, what we do with Keith and what you do, I think it's this very invisible thing that we do almost. More and more it's about, we deny this part of it. And somehow I truly believe by denying this is why we are in so much trouble in our times. So I would like to have your opinion on that, you know, Frank.
Well, I think it's true that there is certainly still a great deal of denial of death, though I think this is changing. I think it's changing as generations come into more honesty. You know, one of the things that I think we can do is be curious with our children about death. It's inevitable that a 3-year-old will ask the sort of question that you did. Mommy, am I going to die? Instead of saying, no, later on, maybe it'll happen later on, we can ask, oh, what is it that's curious? Well, how come you ask that question? You know, let's find out more. Let's be curious about that child's experience. You know, years ago, I ran a preschool for children who were 3 to 5 years old. I did it with a friend of mine. I was a single parent, and so I wanted to understand how to, you know, raise my children. And so I did it by being with lots of other children. We used to have these days where we'd call them dead stuff days. And we'd go out into the woods near the house, and we'd have the children find dead things. And they loved it. And we'd bring them all back and put them on a blue tarp, and the children would have a kind of show and tell. They would explain to us the things that they'd found that were dead. And so they would find the bones of an old animal, or they would find dead leaves, or they would find flowers that had gone past their time, you know, or a rusty old car part. And then we'd spread them all out on this tarp, and they would tell us about them. Oh, this car part it fell from a spaceship as the spaceship was flying overhead. They had great imaginations, you know. Or this piece of bark that I found, this was a bed for a mouse. And one little girl said to me something beautiful. She said, I think the leaves on the trees are very generous because they let themselves fall so that new leaves can grow. Now, isn't that beautiful, huh? I mean, I wish adults could have such a view. I mean, there was a understanding of the cycle of birth and death that these children had naturally, just naturally. We think that we're going to hide them from death, but children see it everywhere. They see birth and death happening all the time. It's just that no one is talking with them about it and asking them, what do they think about it?
So you describe your heart attack as well in this book.
Yes.
You know, even though you were working, I don't know what is the right term, with death or dying, still it had a huge impact on you. You were scared, you were, you know, like uncertain as well. So can you describe that? Can you describe your experience with that?
I used to think I knew a lot more about death than I do. Having a heart attack, bringing me very close to death, was a wonderful experience of humility. I had to really understand that the view from the other side of the sheets, from the patient's perspective, was very different than the caregiver's perspective. I was doing a webinar, a video conference like this one with Ram Dass, the great spiritual teacher, you know, and he's a dear friend. And I found myself getting irritable with him as he was talking. And this reminded me of my wife when she was giving birth. She was quite irritable with me, you know, and I realized that something was happening. And that's how I first understood it. Not so much the physical experience. I'd had physical symptoms during the course of the day, but I denied them completely. But this emotional irritability is really what got my attention, because I was irritable with my friend. And that's also part of one of the symptoms of a rising heart attack. And so I excused myself and I went to the hospital and I had a heart attack. And there was emergency surgery, a triple bypass, which meant they had to take veins and arteries from other parts of my body and patch them in. It was very, very humbling to be part of this experience. I failed miserably. If I were the one that was supposed to be having, a conscious experience of dying, I failed miserably. Yeah.
I don't know how can you fail that, failing that.
Well, everyone was imagining, Frank will do this, he'll do this in a very graceful way, and he won't have any fear, and he'll be conscious through the whole process. This is our idea of a good death, and I think this notion of a good death is a dangerous one. Actually, I think that we cause people to feel terribly guilty oftentimes when they're dying in a way that suits our notion of how death should go.
It all contributes to the fear almost, doesn't it? It's not only the fear of dying, but it's even a sort of subconscious fear about how we're going to die as well.
Right. I mean, if dying wasn't already hard enough, right, we make it harder by saying, this is the way in which you should die. You should die, with rainbows all around you, love and light everywhere. And that, you should only speak loving thoughts, while you're dying. Well, that's wonderful if you can do it, but it's not always so possible. What I found in my work, and I worked with a couple of thousand people who have died, is that regular people, ordinary people like you and I, they face the unbearable, the unimaginable in extraordinary ways. They find themselves really moving toward an experience that they've been moving away from their whole life. And they find themselves something larger than the small separate self they've taken themselves to be. I come from a Buddhist tradition, and in that tradition, and in the secular mindfulness tradition, we place a lot of emphasis on mindfulness. And usually we cultivate our mindfulness by attending to the breath, for example. And that's really great, and that's a beautiful way to stabilize the mind. But what will you do when there's no breath? What will you focus on when there's no breath? After my heart attacks, I was in the cardiac care unit. It's a high-tech environment. I had tubes coming in and out of every orifice. I was being breathed by a machine. I was intubated. I was in a kind of anesthesia fog, and into the room came a respiratory therapist. And he said, let's pull out that tube and see if you can breathe. And I shook my hands. No, I couldn't speak. And I took a pad and a pen, and I wrote on the pad, I'm scared. And I handed it to my friend. My best friend was there. He's a meditation teacher, and my adult son. And they both were concerned for me. And my meditation teacher friend, he said, Frank, calm yourself, sense your breath. And I went to find my breath, but I couldn't find it because the machine, I couldn't distinguish between the machine's breathing and my own. And so he suggested that I sense my feet. But I couldn't sense my feet because there was this anesthesia fog going on, and I couldn't really feel my body very accurately. And just in that moment, I thought of Suzuki Roshi. Suzuki Roshi was a very famous Zen teacher in America who started the San Francisco Zen Center, where our hospice began. And the night before he was dying, Suzuki Roshi wanted to take a bath. And his wife tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't. He was insistent. And so his son picked up his father, the great Suzuki Roshi, and carries him to the bathtub and begins to lower him into the warm bath water. And as he does, Suzuki Roshi becomes terrified. He was afraid he would drown. And his son said to him, Father, calm yourself, stabilize yourself, feel your breath, I'll do it with you. And so the son began to breathe with the father. And after a while, the father was able to stabilize. So back in the hospital, I thought to myself, if Suzuki Roshi can be scared, I can be scared. And so I pulled my friend, the meditation teacher, close to me, and I put my ear just next to his mouth. And I borrowed the rhythm of his breathing to stabilize myself until I was calm again, And then I could signal to the respiratory therapist to take out the tube to see if I could breathe.
That's fascinating. It's actually focusing on someone else's breath. That's a fascinating concept.
It was just, we have to find a way. We understand that we can't open to our fear. We can't open to our grief. We can't open to these very strong mental and emotional states unless we have some stability. Yeah, it'd be too difficult. We'll get swept away. So we have to establish some stability first. Not control, but stability. And so I knew that that was the most important thing for me to do. And fortunately, my intuition showed me one way to go about it.
So if there's nothing stable in ourselves, look for the closest thing outside that we can connect with.
No, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are many kinds of karma, and we don't want to get into that discussion of karma, but there's one karma that's called proximate karma, and it basically means what's in the neighborhood, what's around you as you're going through this particular action, and that what's around you can impact or have an influence over how you meet that situation. So, for example, when someone is dying, if we are family or friends and with them, we can be a calm presence. We can be a stable presence in the room. I teach nurses quite a lot, and I say that their job is to help people move from the bed to the toilet, for example, to the wheelchair. And when they do that, they lend that person their strength of their back, the strength of their arms and legs. We can also lend people the stability of our minds. We can open our hearts in such a way that it might cause them to open their hearts as well. And when we do that, I think we become a true refuge for other people. But we won't be able to do that for another person unless we've looked at these issues prior to that moment, when the fire is not so hot, when we've been willing to look into our own relationship to sickness, to old age, to dying. Then we can be a true, stable presence for others. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.